So this will be our final Live from the Archives for the year of 2020, and we decided to close with this episode on the American Jewish Congress because this really represents exactly the type of history that AJHS has been seeking to document since our founding in 1892. The AJ Congress is a large, broad, rich collection that shows all of the different ways that American Jews throughout close to a century of the history of the AJ Congress participated in American society and advocated for a variety of causes, both within their community and also in larger American society, and the impact that this had on American history. I am standing in front of just one of the many banks of boxes that house this incredibly large and important collection. The collection, as currently processed, is about 843 boxes, which makes it about the fourth largest collection that is housed here at the AJHS. The collection was actually donated in two large chunks to us. The first donation was approximately 200 boxes, which was processed shortly after we received the materials in the early 2000s. We then received a very large additional donation, or what we call an accretion, which was donated around 2006 or 2007. After we had taken in the additional 684 odd boxes, AJ Congress uncovered an additional 98 boxes that came in so late at the end of the grant period that we were actually unable to process them because they were not included in that original grant proposal. So even though the bulk of the collection has been processed and available to researchers, and again, heavily used for the last 12 to 13 years, we still had this additional approximately 100 linear feet of material that was unprocessed. And this is largely material that relates to the years 2000 to about 2006 or 2007. This past year in 2020, we were awarded funding from the NHPRC, is the National Historic Records and Publications Commission, and they are the grant-making arm of the National Archives. And we were very, very pleased to really complete this archive, make it entirely accessible, but also one of the really exciting pieces as well was that NHPRC also gave us funds to digitize an enormous amount of the audiovisual material that is held within this collection. This is one of my favorite files that comes from the AJ Congress. Yes, I have a favorite file out of 843 boxes. And this is a file that is for the Montgomery March, which was held in March 25th, 1965. The AJ Congress was very active in the civil rights movement, busing participants to marches, making sure that Jewish Americans were represented at these important events. And this is a march. This is a folder that was generated by the Public Relations Department at AJ Congress, which was where they housed the photographs and a lot of the planning documents around a lot of these events, not just related to civil rights, but their events nationally and regionally as well. But this is a great folder since this is Montgomery, March 25th, 1965. In this file, we have pictures of Martin Luther King giving a speech in Montgomery. We have photos of AJ Congress supporters here with their signs, American Jewish Congress marches for civil rights for all. Pictures of important people such as Harry Belafonte and Lena Horne, who also attended that march. And my personal favorite photograph out of this entire collection, and perhaps my personal favorite photograph out of all of the collections here at the AJHS, is this incredible photograph of Bayard Rustin and James Baldwin engaged in obviously a really candid conversation here at that march in 1965. And all of these photographs that I just held up for the camera are all available digitally through our single search access portal, which you get to by typing in search.cjh.org. And if you just type in American Jewish Congress, you will find hundreds of entries of photographs, of documents, of an enormous amount of digitized material, which is about to become even bigger as of mid-2021, that are accessible to anyone, anywhere across the globe. So you don't necessarily have to physically come here to be able to see the rich resources that are held in this collection. And so what Ruby, our NHPRC archivist, is doing right now is the process of going through all of these folders, labeling them, so we know that this is Montgomery March of March 25th, 1965, and making sure that all of these things are labeled and organized in a way that makes them accessible, discoverable, and useful, frankly, to researchers, because the finding aid is a tool. It is a tool that is created to facilitate access and to inform people what is held in these archival collections. But to hear more about the collection, about the history of the AJ Congress, and about how historians use these documents, we're now going to cut to our historians, Lila Corwin Berman and Ilana Kaufman, to hear how they interpret and use the rich archive of materials that's found in this collection.
As a historian, my work depends on the kinds of archival collections that the American Jewish Historical Society maintains. And one of the collections that's very much been on my mind this spring is that of the American Jewish Congress. This is one of the largest and most significant collections that AJHS holds. The American Jewish Congress was founded in 1918, and it was really specifically created as a democratic body in order to represent the diversity of Jewish political ideologies, cultural ideals, religious beliefs. And as it developed, it really became very, very invested in the idea that Jewish rights in the United States would be protected as a matter of Jews' civil identity and not only their religious identity. And thus it was really important in its early years for the American Jewish Congress to stand on the side of making sure that there was a separation between church and state, but also to become very involved in the beginnings of a civil rights movement in the United States. By the post-World War II years, the American Jewish Congress, along with the American Jewish Committee and the Anti-Defamation League, became really involved in what was called intergroup relations work, which again is sort of part of this lead up to the civil rights movement. The American Jewish Congress worked specifically through legal means to protect the interests of not just American Jews, but other minority populations it believed needed to have the full protections of American law. So to look through the archives of the American Jewish Congress is to find incredible correspondence and amicus briefs, some that went all the way up to the Supreme Court, having to do with protecting Jews and other groups from forms of discrimination in housing and education and employment. The American Jewish Congress has been on my mind in part because of the protests in the wake of George Floyd and the recharged national conversation about race and about civil rights. Questions about whether the achievements of the civil rights movement were as full or successful as they could have been or need to have been. And questions that I think emerge when one looks at the archive from the perspective of today have to do with understanding both in a clear-headed way the real activism that American Jews and various Jewish institutions and organizations took in the civil rights movement, but also understanding some of the constraints within which they were operating. So for example, we know that a disproportionate number of American Jews were very actively involved in promoting civil rights. We also know that some sat it out. But more than this, we know that American Jews, for the most part, benefited from programs such as the GI Bill or home lending programs that were offered not to African Americans, but were offered to other white Americans. Another change that is present in our mind as we think about American Jews and the civil rights movement, and we think about American Jews and discussions about race today, has to do with the internal diversity of the American Jewish community. In fact, it's been the case that there's been quite a great deal of diversity among American Jews, even from the very beginning of Jewish settlement in this country. And American Jewish historians are more and more working to document the Jews who came to the United States from the Ottoman Empire, who came from places in the Middle East, and who were not just Ashkenazi or European immigrants coming to the United States. But today, because of demographic changes, we also know that Jews of color are a really significant proportion of the American Jewish community. And this fact also stimulates a different kind of reckoning with ideas about the civil rights movement and with ideas of how we teach the relationship between American Jews and American race and racism to a more diverse American Jewish population. To help us grapple with some of these questions, we turn to Ilana Kaufman. Ilana is the founding director of the Jews of Color Initiative, and she's a longtime history teacher. we asked her to help us think about how today, in 2020, should we teach the Jewish role in the civil rights movement? Should we grapple with a great deal of complexity? We shared with her a speech that Rabbi Joachim Prinz delivered in 1963 at the March on Washington. Rabbi Prinz came over from Nazi Germany in 1937, and he offered this speech as the president of the American Jewish Congress. And in the speech, he offered an emotional and really compelling vision of what silence means when one is watching injustice.
America must not become a nation of onlookers. America must not remain silent, not merely Black America, but all of America. It must speak up and act from the president down to the humblest of us, and not for the sake of the Negro, not for the sake of the Black community, but for the sake of the image, the idea, the aspiration of America itself. I don't think the purpose of this piece, its time has come and gone. I don't think that's it. But I think in the past we would teach it like, let's talk about the Jewish role in the civil rights movement, and we might offer this speech as a primary source document to draw us in as students and to see ourselves as part of the Jewish response to civil injustice and the lack of civil rights for Black folks in the United States. But now I think the invitation is to see it as a historical document and to analyze the structure and cadence of Rabbi Prince's presentation and to talk about what does it mean to use illusions from slavery and classroom of diverse Jewish students. Like, what does that bring up for you? And is it the same as slavery or not the same as slavery as we understand it in the United States? In there, it talks about kind of like the plight of the Negro and the invitation for the Jewish community. Like, what's the contemporary application of this piece in response to like thinking about Black Lives Matter, right? Like, how could we use this as an invitation and inspiration in contemporary times based on like the killing of George Floyd? And what is the call to action that we can extract from this and use in this moment? Like, I think what a very cool opportunity to do a curriculum design. Like, there's more to the story now, and that's what I don't think we get right as Jews when we teach the civil rights movement kind of in a global way, as we haven't moved on from kind of our role as talking about it as people of color as the other. And now that there's no longer like an us and them of kind of white folks and people of color, but like we're a multiracial community in a multiracial community. We don't need to be heroes. We need to be part of a community where people all, like everybody gets to win.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. We hope you enjoyed that kind of really more than any of the Live from the Archives we've done so far, a behind the scene look at how the archives are processed and how they compare to other collections and what's the work along the way. And all of that work is happening every day. And it's led by our Director of Collections and Engagement, Melanie Meyer. So Melanie, thank you for showing us behind the scenes what happens. And I guess I'm curious now with this current processing of this like second tranche of the AJC materials, what are some of the interesting things that are coming up, especially in the audiovisual materials? What has Ruby been discovering that is of excitement or import?
Well, a lot of the audiovisual materials are audio recordings of early AJ Congress meetings. So these are meetings of like, I think some of the larger membership, but also of some of the executive committee members. But also one of the things that we also realized when we were going through this stuff, and honestly, it was all listed in the finding aid, it was there for us to see all along, but was that the enormous amount of people that came to speak to the members of the American Jewish Congress, because it was such an important organization. And so some of the audio that we are having digitized is then Governor, not yet President, Bill Clinton speaking to the American Jewish Congress. Now President-elect Joe Biden speaking to the American Jewish Congress when he was just the senator from Delaware. and also Hillary Clinton speaking to the American Jewish Congress right before her first senatorial run here in New York in the year 2000. And that's just a small sampling of the people who came to speak to the American Jewish Congress over the years, plus just the records of their own meetings and their own work, which I think will be really, really helpful and wonderful for historians to get that more inside view of what was happening and how the decision making was happening at the American Jewish Congress. So we're really, really pleased to be able to offer that, because also these were materials that were virtually inaccessible because they were in audiovisual formats that people just don't have hanging around your house. I mean, or around here even, you know, so it's really wonderful that we're able to do that work thanks to NHPRC.
Well, and to that point, NHPRC, tell us what the NHPRC is. And also, you know, this is from my limited knowledge, this is from the National Archives, a subset of the National Archives. And I think one of the reasons we put forward this collection to be considered for funding is because of the direct connections it had to American political life. So that this wasn't a sectarian Jewish organization, not that that's bad, but that this was something that was going to be supported by the federal government, in part because it told a broader story.
Yes, absolutely. You know, just the materials themselves are pretty amazing, and they fit really well into what NHPRC funds. And so, because librarians and archivists love acronyms, right? We use too many acronyms, but NHPRC is the National Historic Publications and Records Commission. So it's a grant-making program that is run through the National Archives. And different years of funding, they prioritize different types of collections. So depending also on scholarly interest, national events as well. There are some years where they prioritize materials related to anniversaries of certain events. But because the AJ Congress was so deeply active in influencing legislation, filing amicus briefs on behalf of the NAACP in terms of Brown versus Board of Education, but also in a lot less well-known cases that people may not think about, because the AJ Congress was filing these kind of briefs in places also like state courts, where people were fighting against discrimination from things like unions that would not allow African Americans and others to join. So, and the AJ Congress was weighing in on a lot of these fights that profoundly changed American legislation and laws against discrimination. And so that is also why we were able to get the funding that's a part of the reason why, from NHPRC, because they really like those types of collections that show broader impact on American life as we know it, particularly with respect to the changing of laws and the changing of sort of these larger structures in America. So, yeah.
And I think one of the points from the finding aid that I thought was so interesting was that at a certain point in the 1950s, there were more lawyers devoted solely to civil rights working for the American Jewish Congress than there were in the Department of Justice. And so, you know, to see the zeal with which Jewish lawyers and Jewish organizations felt almost duty bound to do this work at this moment in American history. And there's a wonderful book I want to recommend to everyone called Jews Against Prejudice. It's by Stuart Svonkin, S-V-O-N-K-I-N, who is also a lawyer, but got a PhD in history and wrote this book about the American Jewish Congress, the American Jewish Committee, the Anti-Defamation League, and looking at what Lila Corwin Berman refers to as intergroup relations in the post-World War II era, and goes into that detail and talks about how, in part, it was a way for Jews to fight for Jewish rights so that Jews wouldn't be discriminated against, but be doing it on behalf of America as well. So that is not to say that the Jews who were involved didn't care about civil rights, but it was also this way of furthering the conversation and furthering this kind of movement into mainstream American life. I mean, I guess the other thing I think that's noteworthy about the American Jewish Congress, when you look at the collection and you look at the photographs, is that early on in the 1930s, they created a division of women, a women's division, and it was led by Judge Justine Weiss Polier, whose Polaire, whose collection we also have. She was the first woman judge in New York State, appointed by Fiorella LaGuardia. And she did work in, I think, family law in particular, but she worked for the American Jewish Congress, which was founded by her father, Rabbi Stephen Wise, and was really important. And women had so many opportunities for leadership in the American Jewish Congress. And in fact, the first woman to ever head a national Jewish organization was Naomi Levine, I think in 1972, who ascended to that position. So not only civil rights, but women's rights were a large part of the mandate of the organization. That's represented well in the collections, Melanie, right?
Yes, absolutely. Both in the photographs and in the documentation. Absolutely. I mean, some of the meetings, some of the pictures of the women's division meeting, I mean, it's a lot of women. They were getting a very large turnout of women who were obviously very interested in participating. And I think that's, we see from a lot of these sort of women's divisions and women's organizations in the early 20th century in America, they're creating leadership opportunities for women in ways that then have much larger ramifications, because then these women, you learn organizing skills, you learn leadership skills, which then they take and bring to their communities in a lot of different ways. And also we also have the papers also donated by Judge Polaire of her husband, Shad, who was a lawyer who did a huge amount of work for the American Jewish Congress, and his papers shed a lot of light on that as well. There's correspondence between him and Thurgood Marshall, between him and Martin Luther King, talking about upcoming court cases and how and when the AJ Congress should intervene. And so it's great that we have sort of, there's more facets to it than just what's in the AJ Congress collection proper.
Yes, and we have a wonderful photograph of Justine Wise Polaire and Eleanor Roosevelt together, because they became friends, I believe, working initially in the late 1930s, trying to get a bill passed that would allow for German Jewish children to come to the United States. And that law unfortunately did not get passed, but then they were reunited, I think, in the early 50s to help Moroccan Jewish children go to the new state of Israel. So it's just amazing to think not only of these organizations, but all the individuals who are part of creating them, and then how the different collections we have in the archive show the interconnections among the organizations and the people.
And we had pictures of Eleanor Roosevelt at American Jewish Congress events. I mean, so she was also, and I'm not sure which came first, if she was interested in AJ Congress first, or if she became friends with Judge Polaire first, but either way, it was clear that they had a lot of causes and values in common and worked together on a great many things. So, and that a lot of their correspondence that came in with that collection has been digitized. So the letters between back and forth between Eleanor Roosevelt and Judge Polaire.
Mm-hmm. We brought up the contemporary connection, I think, in a question that was posed to the chat, kind of asking, what are the responsibilities of Jews today? Right now, we're in the midst of a national conversation about race and social justice. And it strikes me that we don't have an organization quite like the American Jewish Congress, or at least quite like the American Jewish Congress was in the 1950s, 60s, and 1970s. Like, what is the organization that can speak on behalf of Jews, not as a religious entity, but as a civil entity? And of course, there are a lot of other organizations doing some of this work, and the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, as Lisa points out to all panelists. So I think that's an important body to know as well, that kind of came up and rose with the American Jewish Congress, but is still very active and very much in action.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, and there's been some wonderful stories too in the chat of people sharing their memories. There was a question about whether we had, and I didn't know the answer to this, Melanie, maybe you do, but a Rabbi Charles Montanband, I don't know if I'm pronouncing correctly, but of Hattiesburg, Mississippi, who spoke out from the Bima in support of civil rights. And again, pointing out that this was really hard. It's one thing to speak on behalf of civil rights on the streets of New York. in 1960, and entirely another thing to do that in the midst of Ku Klux Klan territory. So that's a very good point. And not all rabbis did. So that's important to note too. A lot of congregations in the South were very fearful, understandably so. But so our kind of American Jewish history with regard to civil rights sometimes depends on geography.
I am not sure if Rabbi Mantelman is represented in the AJ Congress collection, but that name is very, very familiar. So I know that we have materials somewhere that is related to that. It may very well be in the AJ Congress collection, but since it's 868, although I do have my favorite folder, as I told everyone, I am not entirely sure what firsthand documentation that we have, but he may be in some of the photographs. That might be where I'm getting that name from.
Yes, that's great. And we have a story from Bruce Haynes. One second, I'm just trying to be able to read it as it's coming in. Sorry, one second. I just saw it and it disappeared from my screen. Melanie, do you see it? It was a question from Bruce Haynes, or a story.
Can you see it? Or
here, for a personal anecdote. And is this Bruce Haynes, the author? I hope. For a personal anecdote, my African-American grandmother, Elizabeth Ross Haynes, an early civil rights and social work trailblazer, was a member of the Emergency Committee to Save the Jews during World War II, later founder of the National Jury Project, sociologist, and later founder of the National Jury Project, socialist Jay Schulman became my mentor. Excellent, thank you. And thank you for sharing your book. And I think as we speak, people are trying to be in contact with you, Dr. Haynes, about doing a program in April. So I hope you can Dr. Haynes is the author of a book called, I believe, The Soul of Judaism. So
also another question came in through the Q&A, because we got a few there, and somebody asked, when did AJ Congress disband? Technically, they actually didn't. There is still, the AJ Congress is still an organization which is still doing work, but what happened is after the late 2000s, their focus really shifted, and now a lot of their work, I believe, concentrates more on relationships between like America and Israel. They sponsor like the Conference of Mayors, which brings mayors of major American cities to Israel to talk about collaborative projects. But a lot of their work seemed to sort of wind down in those early to mid 2000s. They suffered some financial reversals, and which compromised their capacity to do a lot of these large scale initiatives that they had been doing in the past. So.
Yes, and I think the Madoff scandal severely impacted the Congress, if I remember correctly.
Jewish organizations, unfortunately, who suffered, financial issues due to Madoff investments. So, and they were not immune to that.
Well, thank you all so much for tuning in. This is actually the last of our live from the archives for 2020. We're in 2020 now, and hopefully 2021 will be a better year. But one of the bright spots, to be honest, of 2020 and this crazy year that it's been, is that it did allow us to bring our archives out into the public, and using Zoom and using this technology in ways that we would have never thought to have done before the pandemic. Melanie had just started giving behind the scene tours to the public in March. That was like every Monday, and people were signing up, and we were taking people behind the scenes. But of course, even those tours could have only reached a few people at a time. And so it's been really wonderful to do these shows and to see sometimes 250 people tuning in, and that they're stored on YouTube. So you can go see past versions, and we're really able to show things that we haven't been able to show before, and unearth audio recordings and all sorts of interesting things. So I want to thank you for tuning in. I also want to thank the National Endowment for the Humanities. We received a CARE Act that allowed us to do this work. That CARES Act expires, it ends this year. So if you are interested in seeing more of these, I urge you to donate to the American Jewish Historical Society, and frankly to other nonprofits who are doing Zooms for free, but we're all struggling. And so the more people can get in the habit of making even small donations, if you watch a free Zoom program, that's a wonderful, wonderful thing, and it allows us to keep this work going. So thank you, all of you, for tuning in. Thank you to Melanie and her team for doing this archival processing. And thank you in particular to Chelsea Bracci, who has produced all of this and made this all come to life. So thank you, Chelsea. She's often behind this. She is always behind the scenes, but without her, this would not happen. So thank you to Chelsea, and thank you to all of us. And happy Hanukkah and happy holidays. And let's all hope and pray for a better 2021. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.